Cool. So yeah, so Cecilia is talking us through an introduction to diversity and inclusion. So as with Kathy's session, please feel free to pop any comments in the chat, put your questions in the Q&A, and we can answer them as we go. So over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you. Hello, and welcome to the session on diversity and inclusion. My name is Cecilia. As Elena said, I use the pronouns she, her. And here's some info on me, plus my contact details if you want to get in touch. Now, before we get started, just have a little read through this event code of conduct. GroupBy have asked us to include this in our presentations, and I found this really impressive because they not just decided to plunk a code of conduct anywhere and essentially tick a box, but they actively encourage people to read it. So please do visit the link at the bottom of the page to read the full policy. And last slide before we get started, here's an overview of all the sponsors who have contributed to make this event happen. Now, let's get into it. I'm not a tech professional, so at first I didn't think I'd have anything really I could present on here, but I gave a similar presentation about sort of like diversity and inclusion as an introduction internally. And my colleague, Steve Jones, who some of you might know as Way Out West or from SQL Server Central, nudged me to give this presentation more widely. And his argument was that we all need to get better at diversity and inclusion. And I totally agree. So here I am today. Also, as another caveat, diversity and inclusion look very different depending on where and who you are. But for this purpose, I've tailored my talk towards a Western audience. My background is a bit mixed, having been born and grown up in newly independent Namibia. That's the country northwest, on the northwest border of South Africa. And it's a country where homosexuality is still considered the white man's disease, and where corrective rape is not uncommon. So diversity and inclusion are very different depending on where you are. But like I said, since most of you here today are based in Western countries, I've tailored my talk accordingly. Also, diversity and inclusion is a massive topic, so I will have to skip some things that you can look up on after. And on that fun note, let's dive in. So for this topic, I chose a quote from a diversity champion herself, RuPaul. For those of you who are unfamiliar with RuPaul and drag in general, please do yourself a favor and look her up. Essentially, really everything after birth impacts our identity and our future, and really is a cultural construction that is put in place before us. And the beauty of drag is that it questions all these constructs and that it criticizes the norms, so to speak. And also, as RuPaul has argued, it reveals who you actually are. And most importantly, it provides a safe space for expression of oneself, for a community of people that are outside the mainstream. As US American writer Jacqueline Woodson said, diversity is about all of us and about us having to figure out how to walk through this world together. And the aim of this session is to learn how to better spot social injustices and combat them for a more fair and equal world. So I'll first talk a bit about the aims of diversity inclusion, give a bit of an insight into what is white patriarchy and how does it affect us today, and then I'll look at what we can actually do. So the goal of diversity and inclusion is and should always be to make itself redundant. Unfortunately, the world's in a state that it needs these initiatives fighting for a just, fairer and equal world. But the clear end goal is to achieve a world where everyone can be who they want to be and be safe doing so, where people can achieve anything and live their life openly without fear of persecution or harm to themselves. So really basic and simple things you'd think, but we humans still struggle with this. And therefore it's so important to always keep this initiative alive. And especially, I think the events of the last years have shown us that we can't just brush them under the carpet, but we need to take them as the real issue that they are and need to be combated. I'd like to introduce, quote to you cultural theorist Stuart Hall, who said, "The transformation of ideologies is a collective process and practice, not an individual one. Therefore, we need to all do our bit in this struggle, and we can't just sit back and let others do the work." So, what is white patriarchy? I'd like to go back to the root of all evil, I think, which is white patriarchy. Now, most of us know what that means, but let's dig a little deeper here and look at history, especially Western history, as it's all connected. So white patriarchy is a Western cultural power construct that comes from white hegemonic thinking, which was perpetuated by intellectuals justifying colonialization, enslavement, oppression. So the theory took shape by applying lots of different things like Darwin's theory of evolution, of Galton's theory of genius, and also one of history's greatest philosophers, Immanuel Kant, was blatantly sexist and racist because he argued that white men are naturally superior to women and other ethnicities. Ironically, he formulated egalitarian moral principles and yet defended colonialism and enslavement. So as we can see, this ideology was nothing new and was even dominant in sciences. On a side note here, I use Western to denote the cultural West. And now I'd like to introduce you to Edward Said, who was a cultural theorist, and one of his seminal works is called Orientalism, where he defines the concept of otherness between the Orient and the Occident. And he argued that the relationship between Orient and Occident is a relationship of power, of domination, of varying degrees of a complex hegemony, and that as much as the West itself, the Orient is an idea that has a history and a tradition of thought, imagery, and a vocabulary that have given it reality and presence in and for the West. So to break it down, history, culture are all not natural things, but have become real only through humans, more specifically, humans in power. And by creating an other, as he terms it, the West has had a counterpart it could set itself off against. And this otherness was used time and again in history to justify all kinds of oppressions and treacheries to genocides. Way before the Nazis used the image of the white Aryan man versus the dark evil Jew, anti-Semitic racist ideologies have actually firmly been embedded in Western culture. Think about the transatlantic slave trade, where about 12 million slaves are estimated to have been sent on a death voyage across the Atlantic to the Americas. Where are their stories? Well, all history is the history of the winners. You don't hear the narratives of the other, of the non-dominant one. Just think back to history lessons at school. It might be a while ago, but still, whose perspective did you learn? Did you receive a very much one-sided image of who were the bad and who were the good? Why aren't children taught about the genocides committed by the colonizers across the American continent? But then equally, apartheid South Africa was then widely condemned by the West. And rightly so, don't get me wrong, but it's still easier to see the wrongs of others than oneself, especially if oneself is white. So, could argue, well, how could white men get away with this? Well, as Said said, it's a power relationship. And in this relationship, the white man holds the power of representation, of creating what is the norm and what is broadcast to the world. And that, very simply put, is white patriarchy. So how does that affect us today then? If it's all colonialism we know is in the past, so what does that really mean? One of the ways this colonial thinking still affects us is through white privilege. And that term was first used by Black American writer W.E.B. Du Bois in 1935, when he used it to explain why poor white Americans didn't want to help poor Black Americans. And white privilege is a number of things. It's mostly the fact that white people don't have to worry about racism, of being judged and persecuted and worse, based solely on the color of your skin. White privilege means having representation and opportunities to succeed in life. It doesn't mean that a person's life hasn't been hard. By all means, a white woman has white privilege in terms of race, but in terms of gender, for instance, she is still to a great extent oppressed by gender stereotypes in not just Western cultures. So I'd like to show you this quick video, which is just a white privilege challenge that's been on TikTok over the last year or so, which isn't new. And the hashtag check your privilege has been viewed over 10 million times or so. I need to just share my screen fresh because I think I can't share sound at the moment. So I'll just share it again. Right. And now this should play my sound.
Check your privilege edition.
Or not.
Put a finger down if you have been called a racial slur. Put a finger down if you've been followed in a store unnecessarily. Put a finger down if someone has crossed the street to avoid passing you. Put a finger down if you've had someone clench their purse in an elevator with you. Put a finger down if you've had someone step off of an elevator to keep from riding with you. Put a finger down if you've been accused of not being able to afford something expensive. Put a finger down if you have had fear in your heart when being stopped by the police. Put a finger down if you have never been given a pass on a citation that you deserved. Put a finger down if you have been stopped or detained by police for no valid reason. Put a finger down if you have been bullied solely because of your race. Put a finger down if you have been denied service solely because of the color of your skin. Put a finger down if you've ever had to teach your child how not to get killed by the police. Any fingers left? That's privilege.
Right, so I think that video said a lot already and gives you an indication of what white privilege is. So let's move on to the next topic that I want to talk about, which is unconscious bias. So unconscious bias. Are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awarenesses. Everyone holds unconscious beliefs about various social and identity groups, and these biases stem from one's tendency to organize social worlds by categorizing. They are far more prevalent than actual conscious prejudices, and sometimes are actually incompatible with one's conscious beliefs and values. The thing is that certain scenarios can then activate those attitudes and those beliefs. For example, if you're multitasking or working under time pressure or stress in general, then our brains are wired to go with what we know or what we expect. And it is then that unconscious biases come to the fore, and they make us think and act in ways that we are used to. The important thing about unconscious bias is that it affects everyone and no one is exempt. We all have them, but what is important is that we try to combat them and course correct them. You can see that in all areas of life and very noticeably in reporting. Many of us have seen the way Kate Middleton has been reported compared to Meghan Markle. Here's another example of how reporting differs when the victim is Black and when the perpetrator is white. Valerie Alexander gives a great TEDx talk about how to combat unconscious biases. I highly recommend watching it. So she has 3 tips of reducing unconscious bias, which I'd just like to quote here. 1 is visualize. So visualize a situation before it happens, and then you can change it. Have the courage to examine your own behavior. And lastly, normalize those who challenge the norm. And next, I want to talk about imposter syndrome. which is also called imposter phenomenon, imposterism, fraud syndrome, or imposter experience. And it's the idea that you've only succeeded due to luck and not because of your talent or your qualifications. And it was first identified in 1978 by psychologists Pauline Rose Clance and Susan Imes. So anyone can experience imposter syndrome, regardless of how much they've achieved, but the factors outside a person, such as their environment or institutionalized discrimination, can play a major role in spurring these feelings. Imposter syndrome expert Valerie Young says that that is especially true whenever a person belongs to a group for whom there are stereotypes about competence. Granted, while cisgender men can feel like imposters, but looking at history, it's no wonder anyone non-white or male are likely to experience these feelings more. After all, the colonial mission was to impart a superiority of white men over everyone else, reinforcing those negative feelings towards your own self on the colonized and the oppressed. And even though colonialism is a thing of the past, we can still clearly see remnants of that ideology in especially Western culture. But like I said, imposter syndrome can happen to anyone and outside of work. So I swim with the City of Cambridge Swimming Club, for instance. And when I moved up from our second to our first master squad in our club, I felt like a fraud. I felt like I was the worst swimmer there. I didn't belong. And it takes time to realize that you're worth it. And I still keep relapsing into thinking everyone else is better than I am there. But that's not stopping me. So what can you do? Young argues that we need to reframe our thoughts. We need to remind ourselves, or anyone who has those feelings, that they are no less intelligent or competent or capable than anyone else. So by constantly reaffirming ourselves, we can rewire our minds into acknowledging that this is true. Also, opening up to a friend or colleague or mentor about these feelings can be very helpful. Personally, I also need to remind myself not to measure myself against others. So for instance, in swimming, I only started as an adult, but measure myself against other swimmers who've been swimming since they were 7. And that's not a realistic or healthy comparison. So we all need to be mindful that we're all different in what we achieve, how we do it, and when. Most important to remember when it comes to imposter syndrome is that most people experience moments of doubt. It's important not to let you control your actions or let that stop you. So what can we do at work and in our private lives? I'm not going to go into really much detail of what companies could, should, must do, but rather I want to talk to you about what we can do as individuals. Because really, as Martin Luther King said, an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Now, I'm not going to lie, I'm not a fan of his masculine pronoun he used, but this just goes to show that even someone of his stature wasn't infallible and perfect. While on the subject, I want to talk about the power of language. Language has never been used in a neutral way. During colonialism, for instance, African learners had to learn the language of their oppressor, and they were punished when they spoke their own language. I've been in situations where my accent came through a bit more, or I was a bit slower to speak. And then when I asked sorry or pardon, because I didn't hear acoustically, the other person would slow down and speak to me in a very slow manner, which is extremely insulting. So one tip is to never judge someone who speaks English, for an example, with an accent or makes grammatical errors, as they are communicating with you in their second, third, or even fourth language. Instead of thinking of them as slow, think about how amazing they are for speaking multiple languages. But even native accents have certain connotations and evoke stereotypes. When was the first time we heard a reporter speak with a local accent in British mainstream media compared to received pronunciation? With that in mind, be aware of cultural references you use. So in a previous job I did for a while, I was the only non-Brit on the team. And at socials, I would sometimes feel like an outsider because my colleagues were all talking about typically British culture or TV shows they had grown up with. I think experiences like these have made me hyper-aware of being extremely inclusive on topics, but also certain words. His story, why it got to be male, because men were the only ones who wrote down the stories. Well, times have changed and we can change language along with it. Drag mother RuPaul fondly speaks of her story, and others have started adopting this term as well. Another way to be more inclusive is to change how we use pronouns. We don't live in a gender binary society, so we should really start embracing the third pronoun. How do we do that? Well, we can all make it a habit to give our own pronouns so that it becomes more natural to tell people how you want to be addressed. Make sure you use inclusive language in general. So instead of speaking about your wife or husband, for instance, you could talk about your partner. This is more inclusive to the LGBTQI+ community. And lastly, derogatory language and slurs. So a lot of words that describe someone else are offensive. So it goes without saying, don't use them and tell other people off if they use them. If these terms are used to describe you, don't let the hate they utter with crumble you, but rather try and reclaim them as your own. When it comes to language, we have the power to use, but also to misuse it. We have the power to use the oppressor's language, but also to make it our own. Next, question norms. Like I said, we have all been brought up to be almost brainwashed by Western culture to a greater or lesser extent. Therefore, we have these unconscious biases, and therefore we tend to think in stereotypes and in those categories. And that's a perfectly normal way of thinking. But what we need to do is we need to change the norms, i.e. make it not normal for Black people to fear the police and for white people to think of them as your friend and helper. Cultural theorist Frantz Fanon said, "Imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove from our land, but from our minds as well." We can see that, for instance, really well when we look at beauty and beauty standards, for instance. As a result of colonialism, whiteness was, and still mostly is, unfortunately, seen as the standard for beauty, whereas Blackness has been relegated to the bottom of the beauty spectrum. If you look at even Michelle Obama, a powerful, strong woman, she straightens her naturally lovely kinky hair most of the time to come closer to the ideal of white straight hair. And as crazy as it sounds, many Black women from Jamaica, for instance, actually bleach their skin so it becomes lighter. Now, small strides have been made in the right direction. For instance, with 2019's Miss Universe being a Black South African beauty who wears her hair short and natural. And it all starts with us and with a willingness to learn and to grow, and also an openness to admitting we've made a mistake, subconsciously reaffirmed stereotype, for instance. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, "If you don't understand, ask questions. If you're uncomfortable about asking questions, say you're uncomfortable about asking questions and then ask anyway. It's easy to tell when a question is coming from a good place. Then listen some more. Sometimes people just want to feel heard. Here's the possibilities of friendship and connection and understanding." Self-criticism and self-reflection are hard, but they're the only way we can start chipping away the oppressive ideology that we grew up in. And once we start critically thinking about our behaviors, our language, we will see how they can impact others. And it's only by questioning the norms that you actually start combating unconscious bias. Like I said, everyone has unconscious bias. We're all not perfect, but it's important to realize that there's a cultural system that we grew up in that makes us think and act the way we do. Whereas we almost need to unlearn everything and take a hard look at not only our biases, but also at the system that created these. For instance, don't just try to help a person suffering from imposter syndrome Rather, look at your company, your group of friends, wherever that may be, and look at what has made that person feel like an outsider, and then fix that instead. Only then will we become more inclusive. And this brings me to my next way of helping, and that is allyship. Now, I know the tech world's overwhelmingly dominated by white men, especially in leadership roles. So if you're not yourself a marginalized person, you can still help, support, and advocate for the minority. So what is an ally? Forbes describes an ally as any person that actively promotes and aspires to advance the culture of inclusion through intentional, positive, and conscious efforts that benefit people as a whole. So as a white woman, I can still be an ally to people of color. Or as cisgender, I could be an ally to the LGBTQI+ community. So what do allies do, and what is allyship? Well, it's a process of building relationships with marginalized individuals and groups of people. What you do, however, must be recognized by those you're seeking to ally with. It doesn't help anyone if you're unintentionally harming their cause. Easiest way is to share their content. Embrace the difference and share it. So, for instance, I'm a cisgender white female, and I adore and I love RuPaul and Drag Race and Queer Eye. So I tell people about the shows, urge friends to watch them, follow the cast members I particularly resonate with, and repost on social media. Because essentially, we want to get the mainstream to be more diverse, so that our disabled superhero, for instance, is just as normal to us as a dashingly good-looking Superman. And thirdly, allyship is about growing and learning about ourselves, just as much about the group we are seeking to ally with, and also building confidence in others. By broadening our horizons and by learning about different ways of being, we start to reflect on our culture, our thoughts and actions, and will be influenced by them. That way, we can also work on reducing our unconscious bias. According to Forbes, a true ally should do the following: lift others up by advocating, share growth opportunities with others, not view venting as a personal attack, recognize systematic inequalities and realize impact of microaggressions, believe underrepresented people's experiences, and most importantly, listen, support, self-reflect, and change. You also need to call out inappropriate behavior, but be careful. You don't want to speak for someone, you want to empower them. I know that's tricky, but in time you will learn to see when someone is ready to speak up for themselves or when they need support. And this is a learning curve. If you get it wrong the first time, at least you had the right intentions. So apologize and learn from the situation. This relates to work, but also to groups and activities outside of work. Get involved with diversity. For instance, see what your local book club is doing to foster diversity, what you can do to change or help with that. Think about your privilege. This can be uncomfortable, but if we recognize just how privileged we are, we can start to use that privilege we have to amplify those who don't have it. Praise your colleagues, friends, and anyone for achievements. Positive feedback can go a long way to make others feel included and like they belong, especially if that person feels like an imposter. Sometimes actually small actions are enough. You don't need to always make grand gestures to help. To give you an example of something really simple, as I mentioned, I swim with Cambridge Club, and swimming is still a white-dominated sport. Some time ago, in a public session, a young Black girl of about 10 years or so joined me on the lane. Now, I immediately knew that she's also a member of the club, as we were both wearing our club caps. Now I know that in training, when I focus, my mind sometimes wanders and my face isn't the friendliest. So with that in mind, when I passed her on the way out, we smiled and we nodded to each other. Now this sounds really small and insignificant, but if there was even the tiniest chance that this young girl might have felt out of place in a sea of white faces, I wanted it to be a positive reinforcement. So with all that in mind, I just really want to re-emphasize a couple of things. White patriarchy is legacy, and it's up to us to change it. Or as Adichie fittingly puts it, racism should never have happened, and so you don't get a cookie for reducing it. Don't let your fear of making a mistake hinder you from becoming an ally. Like I said, start small. Immerse yourself in different minority groups by following them on social media, reading books, watching films, series by minority groups, and then go from there. And lastly, always keep in mind that strength lies in differences, not in similarities. So celebrate diversity. So how do you just get started? So you can start following the Black Lives Matter movement or other diversity, inclusion, and equity champions. You can speak to open-minded individuals. They're always happy to have a conversation. And lastly, really just critically question everything. I started with drag, and I'd like to end with another quote from RuPaul, and that is that just to remember the culture, gender, they're all constructs and they're not real. So really, we're all doing drag. Every single person on this planet is doing it. Thank you for listening. I know this was a quick and a short introduction, and any of those topics could easily be spun out into own talks, and I could have talked about Drag Race alone for 30 minutes. I'm Cecilia, and if you want to continue the conversation, especially around cultural theory or drag, I'm always game. So I do believe we have time for some questions.
We do indeed. Thank you so much, Cecilia. That was a really great introduction to a lot of very meaty topics, which, as you say, we'll probably talk about for hours and hours on end. So we don't have any questions in Q&A at the moment, but do please pop them in there if you've got anything you want to ask Cecilia. I have a question, which is, you mentioned, getting stuck in and learning is about seeking out different mediums to learn more about diversity and inclusion. What would you recommend starting with if somebody, wanted to read something around the subject, for example?
Yeah, good question. So I guess it depends on how theoretical you want to go. So you can go with sort of like more, I'd say probably easier reading. It's not light reading, it's easier reading. You can read novels that cover topics like that. So there's lots of great writers. So for the UK, for instance, lots of Bernardine Evaristo's works touch on these sort of like topics, and they will bring you those ideas and those focuses closer to home. So something like Blonde Roots from Bernardine Evaristo, which is sort of like reimagining colonialism, but in reverse. All these kinds of things that just make you start to think about things, but it's not heavy theoretical reading. If you want to go super theoretical, Edward Said is a good place to start. He is not the easiest of reading, but definitely worth your while.
Awesome, thank you. And what about if you're more of a visual / Netflix binge watching learner?
Netflix actually, I think I've done a really good job at starting to bring more content that is more diverse. So, I mean, obviously I have to say Drag Race is on there.
Of course.
So that's on there, Queer Eye is on there. So those are more reality shows where you can listen to actually the cast members actually talk about their experiences, which really just gives you the human element and have them themselves say what it is, so not have someone else represent them, but they can actually represent themselves. So I'd say that is a really good starting point.
Perfect. And very important question, who is your favorite Drag Race superstar?
Oh gosh. There are so
many. Too long a question?
I can't answer that.
Fair
I
enough.
have some.
It's
I
a
have so
challenging
many.
question.
There's, to be fair, for anyone who doesn't know Drag Race, the US season, we had season 13 this year, so there are a lot of drag queens to choose from.
Yeah, and they covered a lot of the topics that you talked about in your session today as well.
Yeah.
Great. Well, again, please do pop any questions you've got for Cecilia in the chat. You can always also contact her on Twitter to keep the conversation going. I have another question. Sorry, I'm just gonna keep asking you questions until someone else rescues you in the chat. So you gave lots of great tips for what people can do as individuals, but is there anything that you've seen like companies or organizations do really well as far as making strides to, you know, increasing representation of underrepresented groups?
Yes, so there's different things that companies do. A lot of the things that you can do to start off is support grassroots projects. So supporting oftentimes local initiatives to foster a more diverse youth. So to sort of like build from the bottom up. So you can have that approach. You do sometimes, although I do appreciate that that is usually the less frequently found option, is sort of like from a top to bottom approach, where sort of like leadership puts in place strategies for diversity that can come from sort of like hiring processes. So things like cultural interviews. Do you interview for culture or not? What are the benefits, or why would you do that? For instance, or sort of like internally, what are your internal policies? Is everyone obliged to give their pronouns, for instance? Do people feel safe that they can express their views, that they can be not mainstream without having to fear and any homophobic behavior, for instance?
Yeah, I'd say it's very important for people to, you know, feel safe to express themselves, especially in a workplace environment. Great. And also, as Ben mentioned earlier, you'll be presenting at Dataverse later this year. Hi, Ben.
Yes, I forgot
Did you want to mention a bit more about that?
That's what I'm here for. Shameless self-plugs.
Well, I mean, Dataverse isn't just like, it's not about you, Ben, or I say you, I mean, as Cecilia mentioned earlier, the tech industry is largely made up of white men, but Dataverse is a new event to elevate underrepresented groups in that space. And Cecilia, oh, sorry.
While I don't have a specific question, let me allow 2 comments maybe. First of all, that was awesome. Thank you so much. And also, Cecilia, you started with, you were not sure if a tech conference has a place for a non-tech talk like this. Let me put it like this. Looking at the number of attendees that you had in your session makes me slightly jealous compared to what I had over my last couple of sessions. So apparently there is a place for that.
Well, I mean, that was kind of a self-burn, but I'll take it. Yeah, well, I think
it was more stating a fact, so I think it's cool.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very fitting if you look at just the timing, the coincidence that yesterday was the 1 year, can't call it an anniversary, but the 1 year death of George Floyd. And all the marches that took place in the United States to commemorate him, essentially, and what he stands for. I think it's just so prevalent.
Yeah, it's definitely, you know, something that's stayed in public consciousness, and people are making strides to try and better themselves, which is, yeah, it's always good.
That's what we want.
Yes, exactly. And also Pride Month is coming up, so that's another opportunity to practice your allyship. And great. I can see that Andrew's joined us now as well, who's giving the talk, our next talk. So Andrew, do please feel free to pop your camera and mic on and join us for the next 6 minutes before your session officially starts. And yeah, we haven't had any more questions in the chat yet. I've got another question just because I want to carry on learning. I've got my Netflix list. I've got my reading list now. Are there any podcasts you'd recommend listening to if you want to just, you know, do some other things and have diversity and inclusion beamed into your ears?
So this is my kryptonite. I don't actually listen to podcasts.
Cecilia.
Yeah,
You did not just say that.
I am more of a reading and Netflix person.
Fair
But
enough.
there's, if you just Google it, there's lots of suggested listings, and I'm pretty sure the BBC have a lot of stuff to offer.
Great. Well, then, in that case, if anybody tuning in has any podcast recommendations, pop those in the chat. We can, yeah, we can help round out your media consumption, Cecilia.